So when we're working in type in Illustrator, this is where some of the workspaces can come in handy. What I like to do is if I'm specifically just working in type, I'll switch to typography, and then it opens up a lot more panels, a lot more options. We're not really going to be using these. We're going to be using some of these, but I like to minimize those personally, just so I have as much screen space as possible. But for right now, we're just going to be working with our character tool, and the reason, there we go. The reason I like to leave that open is because it's way easier than, and I'll show you, than using the control at the top. Because when you're using the control at the top, once you click away from it, it goes away. So it's just nice to have this sort of be more static. So talking about kerning and tracking. So what we're going to do, and this is also what we're going to be doing for this first part of our assignment. I'm just going to sort of arbitrarily make this large. So these are the kind of things that have a tendency to drive designers crazy, right? So when we talk about kerning and tracking, again, kerning is the space in between individual letters, and the tracking is the overall space between a group of letters, right? And again, sometimes you would use them in tandem. A lot of times you would use kerning and tracking. Again, generally you don't use tracking just by itself. If you were to use one of the two by themselves, it would be kerning. And where I'm talking about with things that, when I say it drives designers crazy, you might not pick up on it right away, but every font handles a little bit differently. And even if you have your kerning and your tracking set to auto track or auto kern, it's still kind of a computer, not necessarily arbitrarily doing it, but it's still a computer doing it. And while letters might be spaced, I want to say technically, but that's not the right word. While they might be spaced, I guess technically evenly, because of some of the letter forms, the visual, some of the letters are going to look wider than the others, so that's where you need to make adjustments. Like, for example, if you look at these letters here, like these two T's are relatively tight, and then with the R it's a little bit tight, and then you can see you have a wider gap here and a way wider gap here with the vertical letter forms. I would generally say the space between the D and the Y isn't bad, and then you have this giant space here and this giant space here. You kind of fit a truck through. So these are the kind of things that we often fix as designers, especially if you look at logos. I tend to nitpick logos big time when it comes to kerning. If the kerning is off in a logo, it's like nails on a chalkboard to me. So when we're designing with logos, you want to make sure that, especially if you have text in a logo, obviously, you want to make sure that your kerning is super even and super on point. And it's not necessarily arbitrary because it's visual, and so there's going to be tastes. Like some people tend to kern a little bit looser than others. But in general, you basically just want to kind of fix this and make it a little bit more even. So what we're going to do for our assignment is we're going to do 4, sets of kerning. So we're going to be doing one that's relatively average, and another one we're going to do it loose, and I'll show you. We're going to do a loose one, and then we're going to do another set. We're going to do one with a serifed font and one with a sans serif font. If you guys haven't heard of that before, a sans serif font is basically a font like this, like Helvetica, Arial, what is this, Myriad? Whereas like a serifed font, even if we copy this, change this to good old Times, those are your serif fonts. So a serif is basically this little tail, for lack of a better word, I guess. These little extra little tails on some of the letters. And because you have some of these serifs, like right here, even though I copied this, right, and I just changed the font, you can see with a serif font and also with just being a different font in general, the auto kerning is much tighter, and these are almost these are almost touching each other, and these are like super tight, where without the serif, you know, you would see you'd almost have a similar space here. But even with or without the serif, like this font is just super tight right there, and then you'll see the N and the A is a little bit more normal. So each font individually is going to have to be kerned a little bit differently. So if you were to use a serif font that was different from Times, let's see if we can just grab a random one. Like technically that's a serif font. So even though these are both serif fonts, again, just being different fonts in general, the way that the letter forms are, like the D and the Y here, and again, these are super tight. This is a little bit looser. You get the idea. Each individual font you're going to be kerning and tracking differently. So I'll show you. I'm just going to get rid of. Well, I'll leave that there. So we talk about. So we have our kerning and tracking. It is underneath. I'm just going to bring that to 64 just to be nitpicky. Your kerning is here under character, and this is where I say I like to have this palette out more statically. That's not a word. Because once we're dealing with, like, let's say we want to kern here, and then, you know, you set this whatever, and then when you go to this one, that goes away, and then you got to go back up, and then not that it's that much of a pain, but it's just kind of, I don't know, I find it easier just to go in here and click and then go to your next letter and click, etc., etc. So you'll see here, and again, if you hover over it should, there we go, set the kerning between two characters, and you can see because it has the V and the A, which is a good example, and this sort of space indicator between the V and the A, and then you have set the tracking for selected characters, and it's sort of highlighting all of the characters. So tracking, again, and I tend not to use tracking too much if I'm just doing like a regular, I'm just doing a sort of average line spacing or type spacing. But you can see as you set, you know, as you set your tracking, it just kind of overall, so even if you were to do it like relatively loose, it just does the overall letter spacing between all the selected letters. But you'll see you still have to get in here. If you wanted to even this up, you would still probably want to tighten this space up with your kerning. I might as well go ahead and do it. So with our kerning, so we have our overall tracking set to 75, which widens it out. And then here, generally what I do is I bring it down a bunch. So that was a little too much, I guess. Let's try 25. And that's not too bad. Now this is super subtle. I'll zoom in a little bit. These can be super subtle, and you get a lot of visuals that sort of get in the way too. So like when you're selecting your text or you're hovering over your text, you get that blue line that can be visually distracting. So a lot of times I'll pull away. I'll pull my my cursor away just so that goes away, and then I don't have as many visuals that are as distracting. And then we could tighten this one up a little bit. So this is like, it's not too bad. I might play around with this space a little bit. I'm not going to go too crazy for this demo, but that's a little too much. Oops. And you're going to be putting your cursor in between the letters and basically adjusting the kerning that way. What you want to, a way to think about it, is I had a professor say this once, and I thought it was kind of cheesy until I really sort of started getting used to it. You sort of want to imagine that you're filling the negative space with sand, and you have an even amount of sand in between each letter, right? So you're going to have, like I said, with letters that are more vertical, like between this H and the U, you could bring that in a little bit tighter than you would for a space here, or a little bit looser rather. You could bring this in a little bit tighter because you have all this negative space here. So you could get away with bringing, if you had a vertical or a horizontal, a vertical rather, and a diagonal with like an A and an N, you could get away with tightening this space up a little bit more than you would. And the same thing with a round letter and a vertical. And when you get into like even here, you could probably get away with tightening it up, but once you start working with it, you'll sort of start to get it. And then I'll also post, there's an online kerning game that someone came up with. It's actually kind of cool, and it will allow you to visually to just drag the letters, and then it'll sort of like rate your score, which is kind of, I don't know, I find it fun, I guess. I'm kind of a nerd that way. So what we're going to have you do, and this is a little bit looser than I would go, so what we're going to have you do is we're going to have you kern and track. This is a little bit more than average, but kern and track an average letter spacing. And then what we're going to do for your next one is go super wide. And you can even go more than 200. And for any of these, like any of these tools, if you wanted it to be even more, you don't have to just use the presets. You can go to 300 if you want. And there are times that we have kerning that is super wide like that, like the Orno Brewing logo that I showed a while back, the first day of class. I should have had it up, but the Orno Brewing and Company were all fit in the same amount of horizontal space, so it was a nice, like visually it was a nice tight sort of rectangle. So you'd have Company was a smaller font, but it was kerned and tracked really wide, and then Brewing was a little bit bigger, and it was kerned a little bit tighter. And then Orno was obviously the biggest. I would pull up their website, but they're using their new logo. So I had Company kind of kerned really wide like this. So I set my tracking, let's say, this is where like it's a good point to start. So I would start at like 300 or start really wide, and then you can adjust with your tracking here, and you can kind of look back, and you can kind of see that, again, this space is a little bit wider, and a lot of times zooming out helps. Often I have a friend that if you're on your selection tool, and you go to the edge of what you have selected, you see that arrow changes, and if you hold shift and rotate it, you can kind of flip it upside down. I have a friend that will kern upside down, so that way it sort of like tricks his brain to not see it as letters, so it's just shapes rather than letters. Personally, I hate doing that. A lot of people, like a lot of artists, when they draw, if they're doing like they're drawing from like a still life or something like that, or drawing from another either from an object, it's hard to do with objects obviously, or other images, they'll flip the images, and that way it looks like just shapes rather than, so if you're drawing a person or something like that, like from a portrait, like sometimes it's easier to flip it upside down, so you sort of trick your brain to where it looks like just positive negative space rather than letter forms. What I do a lot is I'll zoom out, or if I'm zoomed in, if I'm working here, since I'm super blind, I'll just kind of look over my glasses, and like already even from this relatively close distance, it's not super blurry, but blurry enough to where it kind of like blurs the edges, and it gives you a more gives you more of a sense of the positive negative space. And these are one of the things I like. Positive negative space is what we're really looking at, and that's one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning of class. And since I sort of already had this kerned before and then just set the tracking, you'll see when there's a blank number here, it basically just means that there's different settings per letter. Like if you had two different fonts or two different font sizes, this would be blank if you had something that was 64 and another one that was like 30, for example. So that's all that means. So if you zoom way out, you can see that this actually isn't too bad for a wide kern. And again, with verticals, you could get away with having them a little bit tighter. I think 50 is probably going to be too much. That's not too bad. And then I'm going to arrow over. bring that in a little bit. And basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the spacing similar to the spacing that I have here, because I feel like these are a little bit more even. And depending on how you want to work, some people work if you have a longer word, like when I was kerning the company in Orono Brewing Company, I'll kind of start in the middle and work out. That way it's a little bit easier to get it more even like that. Let's say for argument's sake, let's do this all lowercase sort of as like one word. What I might do is I might work with like the three innermost letters and then work out from there, because once you start to establish, you know, what you're happy with, and you can work from there. Personally, I feel like working from the middle out has a tendency to give me a better overall visual sense, rather than starting just sort of starting arbitrarily from left to right. You know what I mean? But even if we had this sort of looking like one word, that's still fairly even. And we could probably get away with putting more space here, because we have, click away from that just so I don't have the cursor there. You know, and again, probably get away with putting a little more space there. And you don't have to use the presets if you find that like 50 is way too wide, but 25 is too tight. You know, you want to try 30. You know, for example, you can even use the arrows, and if 38 ends up being the magic number, that's fine as well. So you can you can type in the numbers. I would start with the presets. That's generally what I'll do, is I'll start with the presets and then work from there. So what we're going to do, for this assignment is you're going to kern your name in a sans serif font rather, and also a serif font, and you're going to have them one loose, and I'll just kind of do this just to show you as an example, one really loose and one more average, and have them kerned nice and evenly. And again, this when you're first playing with kerning, kerning and tracking, it can seem admittedly super boring. I know, like, showing this demo, you're kind of like, all right, great, awesome letters. But it's honestly, it's like one of the most, like, probably one of the more important graphic design things to learn, especially obviously when working with text. You're not kerning things that are not text, but especially when you're working with logos. When you're working with later, when we move on to the semester, when we're working with more things more in like the advertisement sense, like if you look at, you know, take a look at some advertising, or take a look at some good things to see are, like, look at some more, they don't have to be crazy high end, but like higher end magazines, and look at the advertisements in there, versus like BMW ads are really good to look at, versus like those cheap mailers that come to your house. Because those are usually just ad farms that are just putting them out there quick and dirty, put them out and get them done. And you'll see a lot with car ads, since I used to work in the automobile industry. In advertising, car ads tend to make me crazy. But like those cheap, you know, you get them almost every day, paper car ads. You'll see, especially if you look at the pricing and the names, you'll see they don't bother kerning at all, versus something that, you know, somebody spends money on. You'll see the kerning and tracking is a lot better, and it makes for more readable documents and more readable presentations. Like when you have an advertisement and you have a block of text and it's kerned and tracked poorly, and you have letters crashing into each other, and even the line spacing, which we'll get into later, you know, it just helps with readability, right? When you're trying to get information out there to people, obviously you want them to read and understand what you're advertising, right? So this is sort of the start of that, is to present something that is visually appealing, also leads to better readability, right?